Before I tell you what happened, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and ring that bell, because if you think this is just another HOA meltdown, you haven't seen the full story. This begins like every nightmare suburban showdown, but it ends with a truth that turned a petty crusade into a legal and emotional apocalypse for one very angry woman. I arrived at my cabin on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of light that makes the pines look like they're dipped in gold. I hadn't been back in months. Work, life, and a long cold season kept me away, but the place was mine. Not just the cabin, not just the parcel of land under the porch. The valley, every ridge and field, every access road and dock, all the way down to the creek that sang beneath the maples. That was the part they never expected. That was the secret in the deed. I could see it all from the lane, the valley opening like a hand, and for a moment, standing on my porch with the old wooden railing under my palm, I felt the heavy, uncomplicated rightness of owning a place like this. Word travels fast in neighborhoods where control is a community hobby, and the HOA's idea of community was enforcement. They called themselves guardians of curb appeal. They called themselves stewards. I called them persistent. A few weeks before, a notice had been left tacked to my mailbox. Unpermitted structures, unresolved violations, passive-aggressive with the precise cruelty of a stamp. I filed my responses, sent copies of permits, and waited. Then nothing, which is how these things usually go. The bureaucracy hums and hopes the problem will evaporate. But that afternoon, the silence was broken. She came up the drive in a storm of lipstick and leather shoes. A woman with a name tag pinned like armor. HOA Karen, that's what people started calling her, had walked every inch of that valley in her mind the way some people walk a checklist. Her eyes fixed on my porch like a judge deciding punishment by the position of the rocking chair. She expected a graceless, guilty homeowner who would fold under her authority. What she found instead was me, holding the deed and a quiet patience I'd learned from too many courtrooms and quiet negotiations. She didn't storm so much as perform. At first, the words were sharp and rehearsed. You can't live here like this. This place is non-compliant. Remove the structure. Pay the fines. She spoke as if the valley were a thing she had been assigned to tidy. Her men, 3 HOA officers in matching polos, the uniform of petty power, flanked her like extras in a play. I told them the cabin had all permits and that my ownership extended beyond the lot lines everyone assumed were the limit. Their smirks flickered. We'll see about that, she said. That was the sound of the fuse being lit. When you own land, you learn the language of boundaries, not the ideological stuff you hear in the paper, but the real language. Deed descriptions with their thence easements and meets and bounds. Lines drawn on old surveys that mean something when the county clerk's stamp is on them. I opened the drawer and pulled the deed. Their reaction was visible, human, and stupid. Surprised like a child discovering a hidden card in a sleeve. The lines on that paper stitched together my claim, and for a few dizzy seconds the air in front of us felt like it might tear. HOA Karen's face went from self-righteous to something like calculation. She smelled a fight she thought she could win with noise and neighbors' gossip. She had never prepared for legal documents. The next days were a war of notes and notices. She put up signs. She called board meetings and swung by with letters heavy on legalese. I answered each with calm copies of the deed, surveys, the county maps that showed the valley in authoritative, black and white strokes. She escalated, and I countered, quietly and precisely. The neighbors watched. People pick sides in these small-town dramas not for moral reasons but for convenience. Fences, friendships, pooled resentment. Some nodded for her in the grocery store and thanked me at the coffee stand. The valley had always been a pressure point for them. A place where real property and fantasy of control rubbed raw against each other. Then she did something stupid. Maybe she felt cornered, or maybe the idea of losing face to me in front of the community was intolerable. She organized a takeover. Not a legal action, at least not yet, but a spectacle. A community assessment for alleged safety hazards. A mass inspection with cameras and clipboards meant to shame me into compliance. The HOA vans rolled in like an occupancy, and with them came witnesses to her authority. She expected me to fold, to be embarrassed, to call a contractor and tear down whatever offended their meticulous eyes. Instead, I invited them in. There's power in hospitality. I brewed coffee, set out mugs, and opened my home like a stage. Let them walk every inch, I thought. Let them see the truth and the paperwork and the care. I led them to the back porch, across the cedar plank floors scarred from seasons of storms and laughter. And then I walked them beyond the yard, down past the saplings and into lines of survey stakes that marked the boundary in cold steel. I let them read the numbers, traced the coordinates with my finger, watched their faces when the math refused to bow to bluster. HOA Karen lost her composure like a glass in a fist. She tried to reassert control. "You're making a mockery of community standards," she said, her voice climbing as if volume could replace legality. People leaned in, neighbors who had half-formed opinions and a hunger for drama. I could feel the pressure of their gazes like a tide. And then, in a moment that has the simplicity of a bad decision, she took it up a notch. She accused me of trespassing on communal land, accused me of interfering with property they swore belonged to everyone. It was a clever dodge. Make the argument about shared ownership and people forget to ask for deeds. But there's an old rule in these battles. Never feed the beast with lies when truth is calorie enough. I produced the historical survey, the notarized map that showed how the valley was partitioned a generation before she was born. The notary's ink had the weight of a past that doesn't lie easily. The conversation shifted from accusation to scrambling. Her hands, which had been so steady when commanding, now fluttered through papers she pulled from a folder containing the kind of half-truths that crumble under cross-examination. The neighbors began to murmur, and murmurs are dangerous because they carry curiosity and doubt rather than allegiance. By the time the sun slid behind the western ridge, casting long shadows that made every pine a trembling silhouette, HOA Karen's tolerance evaporated. She called the county inspector, she texted the board, she sent a dozen messages into the neighborhood group that read like a call to arms. I stood on the porch, looking at my valley, feeling the thin and fierce satisfaction of someone who had worked and paid and waited to be believed. The fight was no longer just about my cabin. It was about the idea of who gets to claim and who gets to command, and that is when small petty cruelties become public theater. The next morning there was a clipboard on my doorstep and a woman at the gate with a camera, giddy with the moral certainty of someone performing righteousness for clicks. I let them film the creek and the dock and the posts with their HOA placards, the things they had labeled as violations in a vocabulary that conveniently ignored deeds. I let them taste the valley. While they cataloged, I called a meeting, not with the HOA but with a lawyer I trusted, the kind who reads old maps for fun and understands how to show up in a courtroom with a story that sounds like a confession to judges who hate flimsy rhetoric. You need to understand how dramatic the board wanted this to be. There were secret messages, whispered strategies, and a plan to present me at their monthly meeting as a cautionary tale. The man who thought he could out-own the community. They wanted applause to be the heroes who kept order. Instead, I gave them documents, witnesses, and the quiet insistence of someone who wouldn't be shamed by theatrics. At the hearing, the room smelled like coffee and anxious cologne. HOA Karen arrived with theatrical flair. A folder, a speech, a look practiced in the mirror. She presented photos of my cabin taken at odd angles, selective close-ups that suggested disrepair. She spoke of community safety and a pattern of disregard. The board nodded like a chorus trained to affirm. Then I stood. I didn't roar. I read the county records, the chain of title, the surveyor's notes, names and dates that mattered because they were stamped and notarized. I told the story of buying the valley in installments, of paperwork and patience, of paying taxes on every acre, of contracts signed in town offices while the moon hung over the county courthouse. There was a moment when the chair of the board tried to cut me off. A practiced interruption meant to reclaim the narrative. I let him. People notice how you handle interruptions. I smiled and kept reading. We laid out the easements, the access rights, the environmental protections that meant my ownership also came with responsibility, to the creek, to the wildlife, to the people who used our docks. Ownership wasn't selfishness. It had been stewardship. The evidence stacked itself like a quiet wall between claims and accusations. Once the legal paper was on the table, the theatrics lost their punch. HOA Karen's eyes shifted. Anger has many faces. Indignation, fury, then something thinner. humiliation. She tried a final gambit, to paint me as the bad neighbor, the one who refused to compromise. It was a clever emotional appeal, but it clashed with reality. People in that room had seen me shovel snow off the community path, had watched me lend tools to a neighbor, had heard me refuse compensation when a creekside family wanted a private dock. Reputation matters in small towns, and mine had been built in quiet usefulness, not loud conquest. When the board voted, their decision was bureaucratic and definitive. My deed stood. The HOA's claim failed in the face of recorded law, and their proposed sanctions were dismissed. The room exhaled with a complicated mix of relief and resentment. I could have left it there, vindicated, quiet, the valley returned to its natural order, but some fights don't end with a vote. Some battles leave embers. HOA Karen did not accept the decision gracefully. She took it to the neighborhood group online, posting hours-long rants that read like a person dismantling themselves for public consumption. She accused me of arrogance, of hoarding, of changing the character of the valley. Her posts gained traction with people hungry for someone to direct their annoyance at. She organized petitions, signed and stamped with names from driveways I'd never visited. The board tried to distance itself, the way institutions disown their most theatrical members when liability knocks. But social media has the blunt power of the loudest voice, and she used it like a megaphone. That's when escalation becomes personal. My mailbox was keyed one night, a petty vandalism that could have been dismissed as kids playing at cruelty. Then someone left a stack of flyers at my gate accusing me of blocking communal access. My dog was threatened, a civil note of intimidation, and a window was vandalized with paint. When intimidation crosses from letters to property damage, the law stops being an abstract argument and becomes a shield you must use. I filed police reports, gathered receipts for repairs, and kept the logs open like a ledger of trouble. Every incident bought me a piece of evidence, and the pattern looked less like a random series of annoyances and more like a directed campaign. When the county prosecutor finally called HOA Karen in for questioning about her role in the harassment, she was stunned. No one wants to be the subject of an inquiry that peels back the curtain on their performance. The investigation revealed a trail. The flyers traced back to a printer with her account. The vandalism linked to a neighbor who admitted to acting under pressure. And the social posts showed a level of coordination she later insisted she had not authorized. The truth, when it has to be documented, is a patient thing. It waits until you are ready to stop pretending. In the end, the law did what the deed already had. It reaffirmed ownership and offered remedies. What the papers could never fully fix was the way the valley changed between the time I left and the moment I returned. There are scars on fences, on community trust, in the cautious glances of neighbors who now measure what to say. HOA Karen moved away some months later. Rumor says she took a job in a town where control comes with a larger office and fewer witnesses. Some will tell you she was vindicated in small ways. A sympathetic comment here, a whispered regret there, but the valley, now quieter in some ways, is still mine. If there is a moral here, it isn't that property wins over people or that paperwork defeats passion. It is this: ownership is a responsibility as much as a right, and the moment you treat land as a stage for someone else's righteousness, you invite trouble. I could have been the person who retreated, who answered the letters with silence and let the story burn itself out. Instead, I chose to stand with records, to speak my truth where it mattered, and to let the valley, with its creeks and docks and old fence posts, speak through the ink of a deed. So when HOA Karen lost IT when I came back to my cabin, it wasn't because I had a better temper or blunter words. It was because I had patience, proof, and the stamina to turn a petty dispute into a clear settlement of fact. That's not a satisfying ending for drama-hungry bystanders. But it's the ending that matters when you look back from a porch on a late fall evening and listen to the valley breathe. If you like this story, hit like, subscribe, and share, because small-town showdowns are everywhere, and someone's always keeping score.